but she's actually in a dentist chair right now, so she can't be with us. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce these three amazing folks. All right, so first up, we have Brad Feld. Brad's become one of the best known and loved early stage startup investors in the world. After creating and selling a successful business as a student at MIT, he became an active angel investor and has since started Foundry Group. I have a feeling there's more between that story too, and I know there is a lot more. Brad smiles and nods. He's also written numerous books, which hopefully many of you have enjoyed, about entrepreneurship, about startup communities, and he also lives by the Give First mantra, which has allowed him to be accessible to a huge number of entrepreneurs. He's kind of a living legend. So that's Brad. Next, we also have Cheryl. So Cheryl Kellond, she might be one of the hardest working people in the startup tech world, which is saying something. She's held a number of senior executive positions in the Bay Area. She was the CEO of a women's fitness device company. And in 2015, she joined this Colorado Denver Boulder startup community. So after joining this startup community, she actually became one of our first prospective CEOs in the 10-10-10 cohort, where she was inspired to create Apostrophe Health, which she is now the CEO of. And Apostrophe Health actually went through Techstars, which, as many of us know, Brad Feld was one of the co-founders of. So last but absolutely not least, we have Tom Higley. So Tom started his career actually as a musician, little known fact, and an attorney, before actually starting his first venture in 1993, and then he met Brad in 1995 when he was an advisor on his second venture. And then Brad actually introduced Tom to his upcoming co-founder in Service Metrics. And then this is kind of a crazy journey. This is one we don't hear about a lot, but Service Metrics, after 16 months, sold for $280 million. And then lots of other things in between happened, but now Tom has created and founded 10-10-10 and XGenesis to help entrepreneurs succeed. So that's your panel, pretty amazing. And now I'll go ahead and just jump in to the topic so that you all can learn from this amazing panel that I just introduced. So Brad, the first question is for you. And I think you're muted there, great. Hi, Brad. Welcome. All right, so this is a big question, so take your time with it. So would you start by saying some things about what complex adaptive systems are and why you decided to have them take center stage in your new book, The Startup Community Way?
Well, I hope your second question is to Tom, which is what are wicked problems and why is that linked to complex adaptive systems?
Yeah, spoiler alert. Thanks, Brad.
Oh, is it? Good. Because they're closely related. So a complex adaptive system is easier to describe with an example than with theory. And so I'm going to describe three types of systems. There's actually a fourth, which we don't consider because it just makes it harder to understand this. Simple, complicated, and complex systems. A simple system is making a cup of coffee. You put beans in, you get coffee out. You might have a different coffee maker, you might add a few things, steps to it, but there's a recipe. And the coffee might not be any good that comes out, but there's a recipe and a deterministic outcome. Beans in, coffee out. That's a simple system. A complicated system is similar, but it has a lot more steps. And the steps don't necessarily have to be done in a certain sequence. So doing your monthly financial statements is a complicated system. You do a bunch of stuff and out comes an income statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. Or building a Boeing 787 is a complicated system. You might have a lot of engineering and design work, but once you figured out, the manual for how to make it, you put a bunch of parts in, you follow a series of steps, you get a 787 out. It's deterministic. A complex system is not deterministic. It has no playbook. You don't have a starting point and an ending point. As you put inputs into the system, it generates outputs which become more inputs. You can't predict where the system is going to go or end up over what period of time. And then there's an enormous amount of language in complexity theory, phrases that people are, interestingly, because of COVID now, familiar with. Contagion. You can have both positive and negative contagion in complex systems. Phase transformations, where things look a certain way until one day suddenly they look a different way. We just experienced a huge phase transformation multiple times in the context of the COVID crisis at many different levels. You have positive and negative feedback loops. You have delays. You have nonlinear behavior. Like, this is all language of complex systems. The phrase complex adaptive system is really just a subset of a complex system theory. And we decided not to use the phrase in the book because it's too ponderous. It's not additive. If we were trying to make a book aimed at intellectuals, we probably would have used it. But the adaptive part of it is that it just implies that the complex system is constantly changing. My own experience with most complex systems is that they're adaptive. There are examples of them that are not constantly changing, but that's a sideshow. If you then scale back and think about a startup community and think about all the words I just used and the behavior that I just used and I described and apply it to a startup community, there's no way a startup community is a simple system, right? You do a certain set of things and you get an output. Doesn't happen. Complicated? Okay, just do a whole bunch more things and get an output. Nope, that's not how it happens. It's a complex system. And that was an aha for us. It wasn't an obvious place that we started, but we were looking for a framework, a conceptual approach to it to give people not the importance of complexity. Like, you don't have to know much about complexity theory to understand it, but we give a lot of language life around behavior in a startup community. And if you go back to the book I wrote in 2012, I think some of the most impactful things in that book were things like leaders and feeders, right? The idea that I gave people language, even though with leader and feeders language, I don't know if we'll talk about it here, but I made some mistakes with that language because I inadvertently created a hierarchy. And I also didn't give language to the people who work for feeders, who are leaders in the startup community. We now call them instigators in the new book. We really just wanted to create a lot more words about a lot of language about how to grow, develop, and evolve. Again, a word from complexity theory, startup communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. All right, Tom. So what do you have to add about this specific topic? I have a feeling there's a thing or two. And also, why is it so important for the startup community, who's our attendees right now, to understand complex adaptive systems?
Wow. So first, a huge thank you to Brad and Ian Hathaway for doing what they did with the Startup Community Way. The book is amazing, right? So there's this core component of content that reframes how we think about startup communities and how we think about the ways that startup communities help entrepreneurs succeed. It's a big deal. My connection to the notion of complexity, complex systems, complex adaptive systems, started in a different place than Brad's, but in an interesting way is sort of connected to the very same thing, right? This notion of helping entrepreneurs succeed is sort of foundational in both of these constructs. For Brad and Ian, the understanding complex systems is really essential in the context of understanding how startup communities exist in the world and how in the context of their existence they support entrepreneur success. For me, I came at this sideways. I started to think about the kinds of problems and challenges that entrepreneurs were undertaking and was really pretty disappointed. Too many of the kinds of ventures that even the best and brightest entrepreneurs, the really experienced serial entrepreneurs were tackling, didn't seem to me to be worthy of the time and energy invested in them. And so I started to think problem first about things. But that then sucked me down a rabbit hole, and I started to think of different kinds of problems as I read and learned about things. And so I found my way to complex systems, and through that found my way to understanding wicked problems as a kind of problem, a particular kind of problem that lives within these complex systems. And for me, that was important because if you didn't understand how these problems arose, And if you didn't understand their context, it was highly unlikely that you were going to find the appropriate tools or levers to be able to address them in any effective way. And I really thought entrepreneurs and investors were afraid of wicked problems, unable to see opportunity in them as adjusted for risk. And so really wanted to dig deeply into what these wicked problems might be and how does a wicked problem arise in a complex system. So now we have this wonderful thing. We have a book about the startup community way that illustrates complex systems and frames those notions in really clear sorts of ways. And that applies to how we think about startup communities. And for me, it also applies to how entrepreneurs can think about the work that they do as they create value in the world. So long-winded answer, but that's my response to that.
No, that's great. And actually, as Brad mentioned earlier, sometimes it's best to explain something with an example. And our third panelist, who we pre-recorded, she's actually a really great example of this complexity live. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and now we'll get to hear from her. So bear with me for one moment. Here we go. All right. Now, we would love to hear from you. Set the stage by telling us the story of you being part of this Denver, Boulder, Colorado startup ecosystem.
Yeah, well, both Brad and Tom were huge parts of me being here. And there are about 7 more parts to pull in there. So I'll make it seem even probably more complex than it is. But so I built my career out in Silicon Valley, and I came out to Boulder for the very first time about 6 years ago. I had a friend who was having a baby, and I wanted to see her before she had her baby, and I'd never been out here before. And I drove to her house, in Boulder late at night, and I woke up in the morning and I saw the mountains and the blue sky and the green grass. It was beginning of June, first week of June. And I was like, oh, I need to move here. And I had that moment of like, this is where my family needs to live. And I was talking to my girlfriend's husband, and he was involved with Techstars. So he introduced me to Brad. Brad was lovely. He spent an hour on the phone with me like that very next day and told me everything I could want to know about the ecosystem out here. And I was completely sold on it. I went back home and, I told my husband, I was like, we're relocating to Boulder, which was a crazy thought because my husband had a job. I had 3 kids still at home, ranging from high school to middle school. And, but I convinced them that we should move. 60 days later, we were driving our moving truck up to the last rent house available in Boulder. And we were here. The transition for me as an entrepreneur was a little harder though, right? I didn't have a network. I didn't have a lot of connections. I mean, one hour on the phone with Brad doesn't count as the foundation of here. I'm going to start my new career out here. And at that time, I was winding down my existing startup. So I was in that moment, after we were on the ground for a little bit, I knew I had to wind up that company. And I was in that worst moment possible for a founder, right? You're shutting down your baby. It's the right thing to do. And you have no idea what you're going to do next. And that's where Tom came into the picture. I was probably at one of my lowest days as a founder. I had made the decision to shut it all down, and someone forwarded me the link to the very first application for 10-10-10 prospective CEOs. And I think the start of the program was like 4 days away, but it was the world's easiest web form. I had to put my LinkedIn profile, my email address, and I was like, oh, I have enough psychological energy to do that. Let me just send it in. I sent it in, and I think within 2 hours, Tom had called me. They had an opening open up, and we took it from there. I started as a prospective CEO on 10-10-10 the following week. And as you know, or you'll hear somewhere in this story, my current startup, Apostrophe, was born directly out of 10-10-10 and what I learned there and the experience there. So it was very impactful for me. But it really goes beyond even just Tom and Brad. Right after I got out of 10-10-10, I actually had to go through the act of shutting down my company. During 10-10-10, I met Lizelle from Women Who Start Up. she had me as a panelist that night, and I announced to this group that I was shutting down my company, and here was my journey. So again, part of this whole ecosystem out here. Elaine from Go Code Colorado was in the audience. Turns out Elaine was one of the very first Kickstarter backers for the company I was shutting down. So I got a big hug and all the love that you needed there to feel, like that you're a part of something and this next step in the journey is right. Turns out because I met Elaine that night, she invited me to be part of Go Code Colorado. From Go Code Colorado, we hired our very first engineer at what became Apostrophe. But before doing that, I needed to wind down and take a sabbatical to clear myself out from the startup I had just started, shut down, before I sort of figured out exactly what I was going to do with all the new knowledge I had from 10-10-10. So I plugged into the Boulder Triathlon community, which has been, as instrumental for me as, Brad's been, as 10-10-10's been. After I sabbatical, did Ironman Canada, I planted my butt over in the Techstars office space at Julie Penner's invitation. They brought me on as a mentor for Techstars. She let me squat some office space because she's brilliant like that, and she knew I was going to do something super. And that's where the company that's now Apostrophe was born. We were Airstream Health back then, and then we were invited into the Techstars 2017 class. So I took the initial parts of this complex ecosystem between Brad and Tom, used it to relocate my family, launch a company, and then pull in, I think, just about every other thread I could possibly have pulled in the ecosystem to get us across the starting line, which is really awesome to think about. And it's been 6 years. It feels like it's been, just 2 years.
That's amazing. Yeah, you really had all the pieces of the puzzle.
All right, great. So it is Tom and Brad, you got some shout outs there for sure from Cheryl. So that was pretty cool to hear just how complex this system is and the way that actually plays out in real life. So here's the other part of the conversation. So now we've talked a little bit about, the fact that complex adaptive systems and startup communities are kind of an example of a complex adaptive system. When we talk about complexity, one of the things that comes into play naturally is equity and inclusion. And this is something that's really important to talk about, and we'd love to have an honest conversation about. So Brad and Tom, this is a question for both of you. So you've both been very active in the larger startup ecosystem, namely Colorado. But what I'd love to kind of hear from you is what inequities have you observed, if any? And this is kind of a three-part question here. So what have you observed, if any, inequities? And kind of give us a little bit of hope here too. What do you think entrepreneurs can do to help prevent those inequities? And what do you think the startup community should be doing at large? So either one of you, if you want to tackle this one first.
Brad, do you want to go?
Sure. So a couple things. There are enormous inequities. So let's start by saying that. In 2012, when I came out with the first book, Startup Communities, the third tenet of the Boulder thesis is very simple. It says you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. And I went on to describe that in some detail. I wasn't really thinking carefully or very deliberately about what equity means in that context. And in 2012, while I had a lot of experience with gender equity, mostly because of my long history with National Center for Women in Information Technology, or NCWIT, and Lucy Sanders, I was chair of that organization for a number of years. And I'd learned a lot about what it meant to be a male advocate in the context of gender equity, and how to be a productive male person engaged in creating gender equity, because so many men, even today, are not productive in their engagement with women around gender equity. I had not spent much time, energy, or thought around racial equity. I also had plenty of views and experience probably better than views in 2012 around lots of other types of both identity diversity as well as non-identity diversity. And, you know, they range on a broad spectrum. Ageism is a very specific example. I think that's not well discussed or dealt with in startup communities in lots of the world. And it's reinforced, for example, by, you know, famous VCs saying, I'm just looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg. Well, okay, he's white, he's male, and he's young. So, you know, let's make sure that, you know, it's useful to include ageism in that dynamic. So there's a lot of pieces around it. In 2012, I wasn't thinking about all those pieces. I was thinking about this notion of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community should be able to. In the new book, I think Ian and I do a lot better job talking more broadly about inclusion, diversity, equity, and I particularly like the language around belonging that's now been introduced to DEI and B, where examples of belonging really, in a lot of cases, directly show how even though your organization or whatever the construct is on the surface may be doing, you know, things that are positive around equity, once people are inside the organization, whatever the organism is, they don't feel belonging. If anyone wants a really powerful example of this, Susan Fowler's new book about her experience at Uber is a great example of lack of belonging. Uber did a lot of stuff around recruiting women, and they did nothing about having the women become part of the organization. So they had very high recruit stats in, and a huge, within 6 months, number of women leave. And then a lot of management functions that undermine the progress of women in the organization because you got credit for having more women on your team. And so where it was totally fine for men to move up and out into different parts of the organization, if you were a woman, you sort of got trapped in your team because your male manager didn't want his statistics to be higher. Not equity, obviously. For me personally, post the murder of George Floyd, I've gone on my own journey of exploration and understanding and learning about racial equity. And in the same way that in 2005, when I started engaging really deeply with gender equity in tech with Lucy Sanders and NC Witt, within 6 months, I realized that basically everything I knew was probably wrong. Almost all of my anecdotes and hypotheses were at best neutral and were probably harmful. And that because I didn't have the lived experience as a woman, me showing up as somebody who was going to fix a problem was profoundly unhelpful. And you know, one of the things I saw over and over again in gender was men would show up and the implication would either be that they were there to fix the problem or that women were broken, neither of which was helpful. I was able to, on day 2 of my exploration with racial equity, apply that same learning, which is to say that pretty much everything I know about racial equity is at best neutral and probably wrong. And so for the last 3 or 4 months, I've been engaging with trying to learn and understand, and I use the word engage, I'm sorry to use it twice, but engaging with friends of mine, colleagues who are Black and brown, and people who I met through friends of mine and colleagues who I didn't previously know, because I didn't understand how exclusive my network was to them, how inaccessible my network was, and subsequently how inaccessible their network was. I've been very conscious, and I've made lots of mistakes, as I think anybody that engages around anything generally does, but made a lot of mistakes with language. I've made a lot of mistakes with microaggressions. I've made a lot of mistakes with putting the burden on someone else in the context of racial equity versus putting the burden on myself. And what I'm comfortable with is I'm comfortable that I'm making those mistakes and I'm learning from them. And that's been very powerful also in my own journey. how that applies to startup communities is there is no question in my mind that even though in 2012 I wrote, you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in startup communities, that inclusivity is not a fundamental tenet of how startup communities work, that there are structural barriers to that, and that some of the structural barriers are really, really insidious, and some of the structural barriers are deeply unintended, but as a result of the existence of them, creates real inhibitions on the startup community growing, expanding. And I'll give one specific thing and then hand it to Tom. For many years in startup communities, I encourage people to go to other people. I say, if you want to engage in a startup community, you should just go to this where people are, go where entrepreneurs are. You know, hey, Denver people, if you want to really learn how things are going in a startup community, it's 2010 or 11, come to Boulder. Hey, Boulder people, if you want to like engage with the Denver startup community, go to Denver. Don't sort of view it as a zero-sum game. Don't view it as that they have to come to you. Just go to them. I live on the edge of Boulder and Longmont. My legal address is actually Longmont. I didn't realize that when I said that to a single mother who was starting a business with 2 kids, who lived in Longmont, who was in her 40s and was Hispanic, when I said to her, whether directly or indirectly, hey, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, just go to Boulder where the entrepreneurs are. I didn't realize that not only would she never do that, she probably couldn't do it because she had 2 kids and she was a single mom, so she didn't have the hour to drive back and forth. But if she did, she wouldn't feel comfortable. She'd be in a room full of people that didn't welcome her, even if they tried their best to be inclusive. The fact that she was having to go to them was a limitation of the Boulder startup community. And an example of an organization that we created 2 years ago that's working on bridging that problem and changing that problem is something called Entrepreneurship for All, or E for All. And it's a mentorship program in Longmont for entrepreneurs. And mentors are in Longmont, but many of the mentors are also from Boulder and from Denver, and they come to the entrepreneurs in Longmont. So just as an example, like well-intentioned, me saying, go to where the entrepreneurs are, I was reinforcing a structural inequity that I just wasn't conscious of because nobody hit me in the forehead and said, hey, guess what? So there's a lot more stuff like that. And I'm hopeful personally that I'll learn a lot more in the next couple of years to actually have that third principle of the Boulder thesis wherever I am, be able to be both more true and me to be much, much clearer about how to effectuate it.
Powerful. Thank you, Brad. All right, Tom.
So I just have to say how much I appreciate this, and I hear this from Brad a lot. There's a kind of commitment to learning and to being open about the mistake making that you're going to do as part of the learning process, and sort of saying what that is, which is something that I've actually experienced with you, Brad, for how many years has it been? It's been a long
25.
time.
25. I mean, yeah, Tom, you're one of the first people I met here. I mean, maybe top 20 people that I met when I moved here.
It blows me away to think about that history and how far back it goes. But actually,
by the way, for all the people who know Tom, you should just ask Tom someday if you want to hear a funny story. Just ask Tom how he made Amy really pissed off at him.
Someday, we need to do a session about that. We need to bring Amy into that at some point. That would be awesome. But for now, it will be our secret, and you'll all have to ask us about it because it's a gem. It's a gem. But this is always characterized my experience of you. One of the things that's really powerful about you, Brad, for me, is that so many times I've heard you pause when confronted with new information and be willing to walk back whatever it was you said or you thought, or so you have never been one to get locked into the frame and be unable to deviate, like, oh no, it's got to be like this, and that's just not common in my experience of a lot of people. So I think you're sort of better positioned to hear and to listen and learn in a context like this, which is something that I think I've learned from you and from others too, but powerfully from you. And I just share the listen and learn piece of this. It sort of characterizes what we want to do with 10-10-10 and X Genesis, want to invite entrepreneurs into a space like that. And the listening and learning piece of things is something we have to do. X Genesis and 10-10-10 and the entrepreneurs and everybody else involved. And pretty quickly we learned that that the DE&I piece was fundamental and that we were really bad at it, that we didn't know how to do it well. I mean, we just fucked it up, right? I mean, we did it at first and had the gender balance piece, but we blew it in the second year, and I think Cheryl's going to say some things about this. For us, there's a moral issue connected to this in terms of equity and equity. There's also a learning issue and how you go about tackling wicked problems. I love seeing this in the book, in the Startup Community Way, by the way. There's a University of Michigan professor, Scott E. Page, who writes about diversity and complex systems, and he's awesome. He's done some stuff on his own. He's done some stuff with Santa Fe Institute. He's done some stuff in partnership with other writers, but he gets it, right? He talks about how powerful and how valuable those other perspectives become, and that in fact, if you decide to jigger the combination of players such that you get the very best of everything, but don't get the diversity piece, yeah, you fuck it up. And I think we've been doing that for a long time in entrepreneurship and in startup communities. And so I'm hopeful, actually, that the inclusivity piece of things, which is, I sort of liken it to the simple rules thing that gives rise to more complex characteristics through time. When we think about complexity or complex systems, we think a lot about that, right? And the evolution that occurs. We think about a simple rule that then gives rise to more complex behaviors through time. And evolution occurs in an emergent thing, happens as a result. Well, that notion of be inclusive is a simple rule if followed, actually starts to radically transform the experience of these startup communities. And it's my hope that you, a whole bunch of people, begin to embrace this in ways that I think really transform what kinds of problems we can solve and what kinds of successes entrepreneurs and investors can have. So that's how I think about that. Pam, I think you have something in the can from Cheryl, don't you, about this?
Yes, I do. I had to laugh when Brad mentioned Tom pissing someone off, because actually that's what Cheryl's about to talk about too. So it just sounds like that's what the theme is. But I think it's, to your credit, Tom, the story, again, spoiler alert, it tells, you'll hear an element of a time when Tom did have to listen and learn and apply. So without further ado, let's hear from Cheryl about her experience with this question. And again, bear with me as I share my screen here. All right.
Speaking of this ecosystem again, and just complex adaptive systems in general, one thing that I'd like to hear from you about is, have you ever observed any systematic inequity within this startup ecosystem or this startup community or others?
Uh-oh, lost the audio. Hey, Pam.
I was also ready to get out of California. So I built my career as on the product side, on the tech side, as a concept to launch expert. Mostly out in Silicon Valley. It wasn't till I was a little bit later in life, like almost 40, that I started my first company as a founder. And I got burnt out on Silicon Valley pretty quick. I wasn't a 20-something with nothing to do except hang out and network, young gun college dropout founder. I'm not your typical looking founder when you see tech founder. You don't think of my face first. I had a family, I had kids, I had outside interests in triathlon, and I was also a founder. And that environment out there wasn't that conducive to it. It wasn't conducive to a balanced life or someone who didn't look the part. And particularly back 6 years ago, I looked the part less than I do now, because now there's more of us. But that was part of the reason I was so keen on leaving California and coming here, partially to get out of California, but it was something Brad said to me on the phone during that conversation. And he said, what you'll see about the ecosystem here is that the human element is never far below the surface. And that is the thing he said that got me. I was like, that's the place I want to be. That's the place that will be inclusive enough that I can do what I do best, and there's a place for me. So that was really formative. When I came here, I told you it was an easy jump to apply to be a prospective CEO on 10-10-10, because year one of the program, it was really just fill out your name, your email, and your LinkedIn profile. I'm like, yes, that is super. I can meet all of those criteria, and it worked out really well. Year two on the program, I was helping Tom recruit prospective CEOs, and I'm a number of a bunch of female networking groups. So I was like, Tom, send me the link, send me the information. I will help you recruit CEOs, amongst these great, prospective female CEOs. And he sent me the year two application, and the questions on it, the one that stood out the most was, they wanted someone who has had a startup exit at over, a certain number of millions of dollars, and, a whole bunch of other questions. It was pretty much, we want Elon Musk and his 3 other brothers we don't know about to sign up for this program. And I turned it around to him and I was like, Tom, I can't send this around. I couldn't even fill this out. And I sort of knew that was not a hard and fast criteria for him, because I saw year one CEOs and we didn't all meet that. But because of that, there's a gender difference in who fills out different forms. We all know this. We've heard it a million times. And women will only apply if they meet 100% of the criteria. And men will apply if there's a space for their name and they have a name. And I saw that survey and I was like, nope, I never would have done it. So it was great because I was able to give that feedback to Tom, and he took it and made changes, which was fantastic. And I think that's what one of the things that has allowed the program to recruit such a good mix of folks, and a really diverse mix of people.
Absolutely. All right. So great to hear from Cheryl on that, and how much all of that is applied in that situation. All right. So we're switching gears a little bit here now, and we're talking about, so we've talked about complex adaptive systems and the way that they, work in startup communities, also in how that works with equity and inclusion. So now I would love to hear from both of you about a different part of complexity, and that's everything related to creating ventures in complexity. So the first question to Brad is, and knowing that we have about 10 minutes left, we'll try to get about a couple minutes with both of these questions. So Brad, first thing, have you heard about wicked problems or given thought to the relationship between wicked problems and complex systems?
Yeah, so yes, I've known what Tom was doing from the beginning of 10-10-10. I don't think I've been deeply engaged, but I've been supportive at moments in time and involved in a couple of things. And I remember when Tom first started talking about it and using sort of the language of wicked problems, it was a very sort of simple for me to grasp onto starting point. There's a total tangent around problem solving. There's a very theoretical thing about P complete and NP complete problems. And sort of, for me, I always sort of thought about it in that more complicated, and complicated's the right word there, complicated way. And I think when Tom used the phrase wicked problems for me, yep, people are going to be able to relate to that, versus when you say PNP, nobody knows what the hell you're talking about. So that was part of it. The other is, it's very interesting. When the Startup Community Way came out, Tom and I didn't talk much about it in advance, and I'm not sure why. It's my mess, not Tom's, because I think of the early people that I sent the book out to, I think I would have gotten great feedback from Tom, so get my miss. But the second I started talking about it, he immediately reflected back a bunch of things without having even, I think, read the book. And it just reminded me of how parallel the journeys that we've had have been in terms of thinking about problem solving specifically, but against the backdrop of startup communities more generally. And so one of the things that I think is great about ideas like this is that you don't have to be the owner of the idea. In 2012, the phrase startup communities didn't exist. So I gave, I kind of created this phrase that's now used around the world. And I'm very happy about that. It's a thing to feel rewarded about as a ego gratification as an author, to have your book end up like having some canonical sense to it. But I don't feel like I own the idea of startup communities at all. Whenever somebody refers to me as the king of, fill in the blank startup community, I cringe. I did an interview earlier today where somebody says, this is Brad, not a Denver Startup Week interview, something else. This is Brad who created the Boulder Startup Community. I'm like, no, I didn't. I was a leader in it. I was a participant in it. And I'd say the same thing around this sort of thinking about complex systems. No way am I somebody who started this kind of thinking. And my exposure to it was in the early 1990s from a book I read called Complexity by a guy named Mitchell Waldron from the Santa Fe Institute. And so I have a long sort of intellectual touch points with it. But so much of what we're doing as humans is building on top of ideas and thinking of others. And it's very joyful when you get at that intersection of those ideas and sort of reconnect again. Like, whereas Tom and I probably hadn't talked, we talked some, but we hadn't talked about this particular thing for a while. In the last 3 or 4 months, we've gone back and forth and interacted on it 100 times. I mean, lots and lots of stuff. So that's just very rewarding, and it allows the ideas to be fresh. So I think they're very tightly coupled and reflective in a lot of ways of each other.
Great, thank you. So Tom, talk to us about what drew you to wicked problems and complex systems in the first place, and why you think understanding them will lead to more valuable venture creation and entrepreneurial success.
Well, I think I backed into all of this, and before I even go another step along that path, I think I remember specifically when Brad and I got together for lunch, and he started to talk about some of these things, and it was like, holy shit, this is awesome! I can't believe that you're looking at and writing and thinking about all of this. It was delightful because I'd been so steeped in this thinking for such a long period of time, and it was great to see somebody else that I really like and really respect sort of pointing others in the entrepreneurial and startup community to that. That was a big deal for me, and I was thrilled about it. And I think it's actually in some ways more powerful that Brad's take on this and the take that he and Ian took with the Startup Community Way is focused in a slightly different direction around all of it, right? So these things aren't exactly focused on the same thing, but they leverage large components of common understanding that are a big deal. So for me, look, there's a couple things that drove my beginning to be interested in wicked problems and then complex systems in context and sort of seeing this as a powerful construct, I guess. It started with somebody that I mentor suggesting to me that instead of 10 ideas and 10 entrepreneurs in 10 days, I really should think instead about problems. Joel Wiskowski, who I'd mentored for a long time, said, "Hey, Tom, I think of it this way," and I think it took me less than 24 hours to be completely convinced that was exactly what I should do. And when I started to think about problems, I dug deeply into what that might mean, and almost immediately discovered this thing, wicked problems. Not wicked in the sense of you're from Boston or from Maine or New England, or not wicked in terms of evil, but wicked in terms of a kind of problem that isn't tame. And you can sort of contrast tame and wicked problems in much the same way you can think about the difference between simple, complicated, and complex. They're really quite related. Tame problems are those things that you can think of from a linear perspective, right? You can kind of understand what the success criteria are in objective terms before you even start, and sort of understand what the steps will be. And there's you can think of more or less precision depending on whether it's simple or complicated. But when you start to think about wicked problems, everything changes, because you can't know. And I learned this as I dug into this and realized that this is something entrepreneurs and investors should learn too. What I learned is you can't objectively determine what success will be in the context of a wicked problem. It's not linear. It doesn't work that way. You can't ahead of time know what the right answer will be. And because you can't, it changes your approach completely. You really have to reframe your thinking about all of it. So I started to dig into that and just try to find the tools that would help me and other entrepreneurs unpack these things and the context in which they occur. And I'm still doing that, right? I wouldn't pretend for a moment. I probably read 40 books and another 100 articles related to all of this stuff over a period of time. And I feel like I'm a novice in terms of all of this. But honestly, there's so much there that's powerful in thinking about how to create value. And I think helping entrepreneurs understand how that value might be created, helping investors understand how some of the world's biggest opportunities are actually disguised as wicked problems, and that the wicked problems and possibilities that can be leveraged in this create that massive opportunity. So for me, this was just these things flowed. And I'll just say this is the geek out piece. There's this Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning article, Horst Rittel, Melvin Weber, 1973, Journal of Policy Science. And you gotta love it. There's 10 characteristics of wicked problems, 10, 10, 10. And by the way, 10, 10, 10, other nonsense stuff, but 10, 10, 10 is the number 42 in binary. So it's the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. So I love how all these things have collided for me in some way or another. And in this case, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning articulates as the first of the 10 characteristics, there's no definitive formulation of a wicked problem. Of course, there can't be, right? Because it's not deterministic, it's not linear. And the last criteria listed, and they're talking about planners, but you could think about this for entrepreneurs too. The last criteria is that the entrepreneur has no right to be wrong. And wait, what? So that's what happened for me. I just fell down a rabbit hole and realized there was so much power here, untapped power, and I wanted to understand more and more of it, and still do. So that's where I am.
Great. And we won't be able to hear from Cheryl, but one of the things that Cheryl's done is she's created a company within one of the most complex adaptive systems there is, and that's health. So the idea of there being an incredible amount of opportunity within some of these systems and understanding what those systems are and how they work, I think Cheryl's a great example of that. So how to throw that in there, even though we won't get a chance to go over it. All right, so we are about at time. But Brad, Tom, thank you so much for digging into all of this with us. And also shout out to the Denver Startup Week folks. Thank you so much. I can't even imagine. Actually, I can. I just did a program that was fully virtual, so I can't imagine. I know you all are doing amazing work, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Tammy, Eric, Ben. Thank you, Brad, for doing this. It was just a delight. Really enjoyed it.
Back at you, everyone.
Someone put applause in the chat. Applause. All right, bye, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thanks.